So this is Steve Renfro here again with Mr. Richard Shields is here today to talk about Moss Point High School. He graduated from Moss Point Central High School in 1959. Richard, we're glad to have you here today to talk about Moss Point sports and your recollection and stories that you have to tell about things that went on in Moss Point and growing up. So let's start about the time you were growing up. I think you grew up here in Moss Point. What are your earliest recollections of sports in Moss Point?
That's a good question. My father came here in 1938 as the assistant football coach, and he was the first assistant coach until two major events occurred in 1941. One event was his eldest son was born. That would be me. And the second was World War II broke out. He left teaching with intentions of joining the service, and they rejected him because he had 2 college degrees that could teach people physics and math. But in 1946, with the conclusion of the war, they were back in the mode of looking for a football coach, and they hired him. I clearly remember going to practices. I remember crawling under the stands after a game to see if anybody in the stands lost a piece of coin during the game. And I can remember most of the teams there and many of the players. But the fact of the matter is I started chasing it pretty good when about 1946, 47.
Yeah. So your dad was Dick Shields. Are you a junior?
Third.
You're the third. So what years was he coach at Moss Point?
47, 48, and 49.
Yeah.
And he had an ultra stomach that precluded his ability to do some of the things physically that he wanted to do as a coach. And his philosophy was that if he couldn't show somebody how to do something, that he didn't want to coach that way. So he left coaching, but he didn't leave spectating and he didn't leave studying. So when I was in the 3rd grade, they actually organized the first Pee Wee football teams, and there was one at Charlotte Height and one at Ed Mayo. So I got exposed to that, not because I had any talent, but because with my father's background, I understood the plays. I understood responsibilities by position. So they kind of made me a coach in waiting, I suppose.
So you played Pee Wee football in the late 40s, early 50s?
In the late 40s.
Yeah. Wow.
I played there. I played in junior high until I was in the 8th grade. I broke a heel for the first time. Couldn't run for a year. Got back to where I could run for a year.
Yeah.
Played baseball, slid into third base, broke it again.
Oh.
And that was the end of it until I played basketball when I was in 58 and 59.
I see. So when you first started playing sports, like in the backyard and all, who was some of your playmates during that time?
Goodness gracious. We had every kid from Main Street to Griffin Street, and whoever came was whoever came. But they understood that there was going to be a game. There was a game every single day. And the fences weren't around there, so you could go out there where the baseball field was. You could have bases that were made out of paper sacks. We pitched from the same distances regardless of our size and strength. You'd have the 2 best players there, and they would choose up sides, and every kid knows who the best player is.
Yeah.
They don't need a coach to tell them.
Yeah.
So those 2 guys had to choose alternatively, and so that's how you made up the team. The bats were broken bats that you got from the high school, and you put them together with wire brads and friction tape.
Yeah.
And they worked fine.
So you grew up right across from where the high school football field is now.
Absolutely.
Right? And so when you're talking about playing, is that where you guys played, right across the street?
That's where we played the pickup games.
Yeah.
But the football stadium back in those days ran east-west instead of north-south.
Right.
And so the baseball field was on the Dantzler Street side, so it was practically in my front yard. And when the football teams played there, the high school teams or the junior high team, my front porch was the logical place to go if you didn't want to go across the street. So many a time we sat there and listened to the game being broadcast and a rocker chair or whatever.
I guess you listened to Moss Point and Magnolia too. I guess.
Every one of them.
Yeah.
A lot more fun to listen to Magnolia.
Yeah.
Only because the guy who did the PA system for Moss Point was kind of short and curtailed. It was like gain of 2, third and 1. That's
Right.
it. Okay. The guy who did the other one gave you a play-by-play. So if you're that far away and you can't see it all, the play-by-play helps you understand what's really happening.
I see. Wow.
And some of it was classic.
Yeah. So probably more than most about the early years of Moss Point High School, back when it was even called Moss Point Academy, and some of the players that played then. Why don't you talk about some of your recollections and what you found out about those guys?
I was going to say I'm old, but I'm not old enough to have recollections of them.
Okay.
But the things that are easily found out is that numbers of very, very talented and accomplished athletes came out of Moss Point. And probably the first one that I found as I was looking back through some of the history was a man named Hubert Fisher, and he was playing at Moss Point in the late 1800s. He finished there, played 3 years at Ole Miss, went to Princeton, played a year at Princeton, came back to Ole Miss and got a law degree. Did some coaching at the University of Tennessee, and according to some of the things I read, he was not only successful, but he was highly popular in the sense that he was very successful by winning, but the people liked him as well. He went on, got to be a district attorney at Memphis. When he was at Princeton, one of his instructors was a man named Woodrow Wilson, and they became good friends and remained good friends for the rest of their lives.
President Woodrow Wilson.
President Woodrow Wilson.
Okay.
That's correct. And Wilson had named him later to be the district attorney in Memphis. Apparently back then that was a presidential appointment. I was unaware of that.
Yeah.
But he ended up being a congressional representative to both the Tennessee legislature and the United States legislature. So
wow.
That was the beginning of a pretty accomplished career. But as a byproduct of all that, while he was at Princeton, he was also named to be the first All-America player from the South.
Wow. Hubert Fisher.
Hubert Fisher.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that's an interesting story. Who else comes to mind back in early days?
Sam Leslie, who I actually had the privilege of knowing a little bit in his later years, in my earlier years, played at Moss Point, had a distinguished baseball career, stayed in the majors for 10 years, played with the Giants, batted .304 for his career, set records for pinch hitting, and when he came back to the area, was very influential in sponsoring and organizing a lot of the youth baseball programs locally.
Wow. So what year did he graduate from Moss Point, or about how old you think he might?
That's the reason I brought my cheat sheet.
There you go. Sam Leslie. I played football with a guy whose last name was Leslie, Gil Leslie. I wonder if they're related.
Well, he retired from baseball in 1938. So that would make he was playing in the 20s.
Right. Wow, you did go back a ways. So who else did you discover in your?
Claude Passo is a name a lot of the people around here recognize because he was an outstanding personality in George County and Lucedale for years, serving in law enforcement. But he was also a very accomplished pitcher. And pitched one of the two one-hit games in a World Series game that's ever been played. But he was also a very good quarterback. And when he went to Millsaps, his sport of choice at that time was football rather than baseball. But pro football back in those days wasn't what it is today in terms of salary and opportunities.
Right.
He took the baseball route.
So Claude Passo graduated from Moss Point,
Mm-hmm.
went to Millsaps, and he pitched for the Cubs. Is that, I remember that right?
Pitched for the Cubs.
Yeah. Wow. And he's
graduated from Moss Point in 1928.
28. Wow. Again, you're bringing some history forward here. So who else comes to mind?
Oh, those are some of the more distinguished ones. I tried to make sure that if we included these in Moss Point's history, that all of these things were verifiable.
Yeah.
And I included these simply because there's documentation that all of these things were done and accurate. But unfortunately, there are lots of gaps in Moss Point sports history. For years I've heard, that some of the basketball records in later years meaning in the last, say, 20 years, were outstanding years and the best ever. The part about outstanding years is true. They have had some outstanding years, not the best ever. In 1958, Moss Point was 28-0.
Really? In basketball?
In basketball.
Wow.
And that won the South Mississippi, went to the overall playoffs, won the first game of the playoff, 29-0, and we got our heads handed to us in the last game.
Oh, really? So
Jackson Provine beat us like a dog.
And that was a championship game for the state?
For the state.
Wow. So that was 1958 basketball team. Who were the stars on that team?
We had some really good players. Jimmy MacArthur was clearly the star. And Jimmy was, back in those days, 6'5", was a big player. And he started at center, made all conference at least 2 years, and I'm not sure he didn't make it 3. But 2 more players went on and played at junior college and then played in senior college as well. Gail Thomas and O'Gwen Clark. Gail was one of those players that matured after he finished high school. He got much better in junior college than he was in high school.
Wow.
But both of those guys were very accomplished, and the others were good high school players. But your question about stars, those were the guys that I remember carrying the load.
And who was the coach for that 58 team?
M.H. Mallett.
Mm-hmm. So that was Coach Mallett lived right there by the Bellevue Street Bio Bridge, right?
One and the same.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I think he taught me. I don't think he was coaching at the time, but by the time I came along, I think he was teaching at the high school. I don't remember. He may have taught me math.
He was a math teacher.
Was he a math teacher?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So he was a basketball coach during that time. Wow. Did MacArthur go on to play in college? Yes,
he played at Perk.
You said that. Yeah.
And played well there. Those teams. Perk back in those days was pretty dominant in the South Mississippi Basketball Junior College League.
Yeah.
And has continued to be so at some level.
So you played on the 58 team?
I was there.
You were there?
I suffered from a malady called lack of talent.
I see, but you were on the team.
Yeah.
So were you the backup center? You're a tall guy. You must have been the backup center.
Well,
right?
I tell people that MacArthur and I together scored 55 points in one game.
Oh, really? And how many did he score?
53.
53. So you came in after the game was in hand. Huh?
But in one game, the center position at Moss Point has never scored more than 55 points.
I see. Yeah, that sounds like a record to me. Wow. So what other any other players that come to mind? We were talking earlier about the Coyotes, and I guess they were a little older than you.
Well, oh yeah. Well,
Yeah.
Robert was Robert was 4 years older than me, and Eddie is 7 years older than me.
I see.
And Robert was the catcher on the baseball team as well as a football player, and I was once again the backup catcher. And
Well, you followed some pretty outstanding folks.
I tell Robert he stayed in my way a lot of the time.
Yeah.
But he another player though that you asked about was a guy named Jay Adams, and Jay was an awesome pitcher, and Jay could throw so hard that at the beginning of practice, both Robert and I would take our handkerchiefs out of our jeans and take them to batting practice to stuff them in the catcher's mitt to get some more padding, because Jay could just hurt your hand.
Wow.
And back in those days, Ocean Springs did not play well in sports like basketball and football, but for some reason they always had an awesome baseball program. And they had pitchers like Joe Cherry and Big Boy Boje, and outfielders like Red Boje, a cousin of Big Boy's, and they would come and they would beat our brains out. Well, one game, Jay had pitched the night before, pitched something like a one-hit shutout, and Kenny Anderson drew the card to start. Kenny had his stuff that night. We go to the last inning. We can get them out. Most points ahead by a run. We're going to beat Ocean Springs for the first time in a long, long time. Kenny gives up the base hit, walks the next batter,
Uh-oh.
hits the next batter.
Uh-oh.
Bases loaded.
Bases loaded.
Nobody out.
Nobody out.
Coach Hammond tells his backup catcher to warm up Jay. He pitched the night before. Jay couldn't have pitched more than 5 warm-up pitches and said, "I'm ready."
And you warmed him up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.
As we walked back from behind the dugout where we warmed him up toward the pitcher's mound, Kenny is walking off the mound. Jay's walking toward the mound. And Jay puts his hand on Kenny's shoulder and says, and I quote, "Don't worry, Kenny, I'll get him out."
Huh.
I said to myself, that's either the height of arrogance or confidence or both. He threw 9 pitches.
9 pitches. Got 3 outs.
Strike 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Didn't throw a ball.
I don't think I've heard this name. Jay Adams.
Willie J. Adams. And I spoke with his catcher about this to make sure I had that story right. He had verified it. And it turns out that Jay Adams died 3 weeks ago here in Morse Point. I did not know that.
Oh, wow. Wow. So did he go on to play in college?
He went to Ole Miss and he didn't like college, and he had turned down a pro offer. So he dropped out and went pro. The Cubs assigned him to a minor league team. Back in those days, they had class AAA, AA, A, B, C, D, and it was like Class C or something like that. And they pitched him every third game and played him at shortstop the other 2 games. Never rested his arm. He didn't make it through the first year before he ruined his arm.
Blew his arm out. Yeah. Wow.
But he was not something you wanted to bet against.
Wow.
He was very, very talented.
Wow. So you talked earlier about growing up across from the football field
Mm-hmm.
and listening to the games.
Oh yeah.
And you told me a couple of days ago about Magnolia playing Ocean Springs. What was it?
Playing Elizabeth Keys.
Elizabeth Keys.
And this was one of the advantages of living where I live, because you could sit on my front porch and hear this clear as a bell. And the game went on, and Magnolia was always loaded. They were very, very talented, and they won all the time. We look forward to that. But the game went on, and Elizabeth Keys barely had enough players to field a team. The outcome of the game was never in doubt. But at halftime, the score was Magnolia 66, Elizabeth Keys 0.
Wow.
And we're sitting there, and the band's playing and marching up and down the field. Public address announcer comes on, stops the band in mid-program. Let's have quiet. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? We have just been informed in the press box that Elizabeth Keys has played 12 men the entire first half of this game. And they're behind 66-0. And he just felt it was his duty to admonish them. And he says, in all of our days of playing on this football field, this is the worst exhibition of unsportsmanlike conduct we've ever seen."
Wow.
And I can't even tell that story 50 years later without laughing.
Yeah. Wow. So Elizabeth Keys didn't do very well and playing 12 people.
Yeah,
that was
the same announcer that one night said they give the ball to Jack Jones. He's going left. He's not going anywhere. Lost 4 yards.
Wow. All right. So what else you have for us, Richard?
Well, one of the privileges I've had, not only being exposed to sports in Moss Point, was to be exposed to some people that put sports in perspective. And I think for the most part, I've seen Moss Point do things that I'm not particularly crazy about in terms of win at all costs and but the most influential person on a high school level in most southern towns is the football coach. All of them drop all their official names and they become Coach Shields, Coach Alexander, Coach Renfro, whoever.
Right.
And they influence more people. And I've seen these coaches, and particularly some of the coaches that are still working to do the same things, to instill values in players that are going to influence them the rest of their life. One of the great prides that I've had in my life is I still have people come up to me and tell me how influential my father was in teaching them the right way to do things, but never once have they said when the right way to do things have they talked about blocking, or tackling, or running. They talk about teamwork, leadership, responsibility. And we've had a lot of good people, and I haven't known them all, and I don't mean to imply that I do. But when we talk about sports, we ought to remember what that's really like. And there was a book written back in the 60s, I believe, called The Boys of Summer. It was a baseball book. It was written by a guy that wrote about the Brooklyn Dodgers and the players there. And I read it. And when he finished the book, the last part of the book was their success as a team in Brooklyn. But a reviewer reviewed the book and said it wasn't really a book about baseball. It was really a book about discipline and teamwork and accomplishing goals. And he says, and that's what sports is about. And that's what life is about. And I remembered that, and I started thinking about my growing up and remembering I didn't have Roy Campanella and Jackie Robinson and whoever on my team, but I had George Bond and I had Mike Warnock. And I had those people, and those were my boys of summer. And I look back on how those efforts there help make us appreciate why you play those games, not to go out. So we came in and they said who won, and we didn't even care. But I hope that all sports Hall of Fame activities factor those kind of things in, because I think if you really look for the real benefit of sports and how people have benefited, I've listened to some of the other interviews, and it says we want to have a chance, and sports gives you a chance, provided that you got the kind of leadership in sports.
Right.